So you run a country and you have a problem. Every few years, you have to get re-elected. And what is the #1 way to get fired by voters? If the economy is doing bad. Because a bad economy equals people struggling to pay rent and buy food and stuff. Heck, even if you run a dictatorship, if the people are suffering too much, eventually you're gonna get overthrown. So that's why your #1 priority as a noble leader is growth. Economic growth. Why? Because if your country makes more money, there's less unemployment, the plebs are at least content with the status quo, you get more tax dollars, more weapons, more nukes, more leverage over other countries, and ultimately, more power. Why do you think growth is the only thing they talk about on the Federal Reserve, on CNBC, on the White House podium? Why do you think they're so scared of an economic slowdown? It's because America is mostly run by a bunch of people who might get fired every few years by voters. And creating growth lets you keep your power and gain more of it. But here's the thing, the only way you're gonna get more economic growth is if you have a giant segment of your population that hates their lives. What do I mean by that? Well, just think about what it takes for a giant country like the US to grow at 2% a year. If your economy is gonna grow at 2% a year indefinitely, someone's gonna flip the hamburgers, build the roads, construct the buildings, clean the sewers, do the bookkeeping, mop the floors, deliver the food, operate the buses, and a bunch of other tasks that are very vital, but also very miserable to do. In other words, you need a bunch of people who, no matter how much they hate their lives, no matter how resentful and bitter they are about giving up on their dreams, you still need them to get up every day and just take it. Take it for the good of the country.
The person who gives up, that's our favorite kind of person. That's inside the United States. Everybody loves the person who gives up. Because the person who gives up just pays a little extra money to have somebody else fix the problem. The person who gives up pays their taxes on time and at the maximum rate. The person who gives up just follows the rule of law and crosses at the crosswalk. The person who gives up is the person that everybody gets to walk on. And we raise people to get walked on. Public school raises you to be walked on. We live in a culture that's literally propagating the idea that to be a good citizen, you have to shut up and take it.
Because if the masses don't do that, there is nothing. If everyone today who works a miserable job isn't motivated to wake up tomorrow to do your plumbing, pick up your trash, make sure the streetlights are working, everything goes to hell.
Any type of program in prison, they're educating you to go work at Walmart. Yeah. Just like public school, they're educating you to go a lower middle class or middle class job. Like that's really what high school is. Hey, by the time you're done with high school, you are educated to be lower middle class. You know what I'm saying? Like still middle class, yeah, but not on the high end. So that's what they want because they need that massive tax base to follow the rules and pay in everything. And, and as horrible as this might sound, God bless them.
It's critical.
It's critical. Absolutely. We would fail as a country without them.
In fact, this is the only difference between a first world country and a third world country. Putting aside the corruption we cover on this channel, the only difference between a first world country and a third world country is some dude waking up and deciding to pick up your trash. The trash man has no real motivation to pick up your trash, so how do you motivate him? Well, back in the day, you'd motivate people by making them indentured servants. They would owe you money, so they would have to work on your fields to pay it off, or else they would go to prison. But those days are over, and even if you could still get away with that, it's not very efficient. If a pleb feels subjugated, they will resent you, they won't work as hard. They'll dig their heels into the ground and eventually it will backfire. So there lies the multi-trillion-dollar question of every nation-state. How do you convince your population to want to be cogs in the wheel, to feel the need to sacrifice their working lives for the good of the country without using force? Simple. You stack the cards against them so much that they feel like they always have to work. You give them just enough freedom to feel free, but not enough to where they'll actually break free. You pay them just enough so they can live paycheck to paycheck, but not enough to where they'll ever become financially free. And when they do manage to save up a meager savings, you convince them to get into debt. The key here is the perception of free will. Tell someone they have to do something and they'll feel bossed around. But if you set up society in a way where they come to that conclusion themselves, well then you have an obedient, willing cog in the machine. And if there's one thing America has perfected more than any other country, it's that America has created a well-oiled nation of cogs. But not just any cogs, willing cogs. Willing cogs where no matter how much they hate their jobs, no matter how much they hate their lives, they will always get up in the morning and pick up your trash. They will always shut up and take it. See, American supremacy is not built on weapons, warships, or even nukes. At the heart of it all, it's built off the collective backs of the middle-class cogs. See, the politicians are right. The middle class is the backbone of society. They're the ones that do all the grunt work. They're the ones that fund the bailouts, that fund the wars. They're the ones that built America into the greatest superpower the world has ever seen. And it's very clear when you compare America to Europe. In Europe, you have free healthcare, people feel taken care of, so people don't feel the need to work to live. which is why Europe stagnates while America reigns supreme. But here's the thing, this game that we're playing is a very delicate balancing act. Give the peasants too much money and eventually they'll save enough to break free. But give them too little money or make them suffer too much, then your hard-working middle class would just give up. Think about yourself, if your salary couldn't buy you a loaf of bread tomorrow, would you still wake up and go back to work? Of course not. And boom, everything falls apart. So the key is giving them just enough to keep their heads above water, but not too little or too much to where they stop caring. And take a guess which direction the US is headed in. That's right, America's interest payments alone on its debt has reached $1 trillion a year, which means this can only end one of two ways. Either we somehow reduce spending, which Trump is promising, but if history is correct, the debt has only gone up under him, Biden, and Obama, or the government will just tax us more or print more money. Either way, guess who is gonna get squeezed? The poor don't have any money to take. The rich are just gonna take their money and leave. So all that's left is the good old patriotic middle class. And if the middle class, the backbone of America, goes down, then America goes down. And if America goes down, since every other country is tied to America and the dollar, the entire world will be pulled down with us. But Jake, that's preposterous. The middle class can never fully collapse. And you may be right, but let me ask you something. Would you bet your life on that? Would you bet your life on staying in the middle class? Put it another way, do you think life is gonna get easier or harder for the middle class? When the co-founder of LinkedIn predicts that 9-to-5 jobs and their comfy retirement plans are set to go extinct in 10 years, and what will replace it will be much worse. When the government's own retirement plan is set to implode at the exact same time in 2033, according to the horse's own mouth, when the dollar has already lost 99% of its value in the last 100 years. When we're gonna see even more exponential inflation in the next year thanks to something called the Great Melt-Up that we'll cover at the end. This is why although being in the middle class is definitely better than being in the lower class, being in the middle class is always a losing game. In good times you get squeezed and in bad times you really get squeezed. Unless you can find a way to escape this game. And yes, there is a way, because within all this chaos, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll go over that at the end. And that is why we're doing this 3-part documentary series called Escape the Middle Class. In this first episode, we're gonna trace back the roots of this cog-like trap we call the middle class, and how they use 3 main pillars to keep you just above water so you keep working. In part 2 of this docuseries, we're gonna go over the principles you need to escape the middle class, and hints is the exact opposite of the pillars they use to trap you. That's gonna drop this coming Tuesday, and in the final episode, we're gonna go over the best way I see right now to break free from the middle class that everyone is overlooking. That is dropping next Sunday, January 12th. Of all the documentaries I've made, this series and this one that you're about to watch might just be my favorites, just because of how important it is for so many people watching, so you're not gonna wanna miss them. They're free as usual. All you gotta do is click the link below, put in your name and email, it takes like 11 seconds, and you'll get notified when episodes 2 and 3 drop, along with access to our private WhatsApp group for Escape the Middle Class. That will be linked below. And to understand how we got this cog-like system, we gotta go back to the invention of the 40-hour workweek. Now to be clear, life before the middle class was a lot worse than it is today. We all know about slavery, but back in the feudalism days, to get economic growth, you would have serfs. Serfs that owed money to you, and the only way they could pay off their debts was to till your fields. And if they didn't pay off their debts, well, they would get sent to prison or worse. And that threat of imprisonment was enough to make them productive. They didn't have a choice but to be productive. And most ended up dying before they turned 30 from overworking, starvation, or some easily curable disease. In the summers, they would work 16 hours from dawn to dusk, and in the winter, they would work 8 hours a day. But at least they had lots of breaks throughout the day, and their lords did feed them and house them. But then came the Industrial Revolution. Now instead of lords and serfs, it was factory owners and their factory workers. And these factory owners didn't really know how to structure this new working world. Suddenly, the slaves had to be paid, given definite hours, and time off. But if anything, life only got worse for the working class. Instead of working out in nature, now it was inside incredibly dangerous factories. Instead of getting housed and fed by the Lord, now they had to house and feed themselves on the lowest wage possible. Instead of waking up naturally at sunrise, now factory owners had to wake up before sunrise every day to wait in lines outside of factories. If you were lucky, you would be chosen to work that day and get paid. But if you got to the factory too late or you were pushed to the back of the line, you would lose out on a full day's wage. And if you got on the bad side of a factory owner, well, you would never be hired again. And with the invention of electricity, life only got worse for workers. Now, instead of working from sunrise to sunset out in nature, now you have to work 14 to 16-hour days 6 days a week, which is almost 100 hours a week. Machines started doing a lot of the heavy lifting, which meant that kids could now work in factories as well. By the year 1900, 1 in 5 children were employed, and it was a dangerous affair. Machines injured 3 times more kids than adults. We're talking losing your fingers, hands, or legs as a kid. Over time, factory work did become more stable, especially in factories where workers needed more skill and training to work on specific machines. People were now hired on a permanent basis instead of having to wait in line every morning at the factory. Factory owners thought they had the best of both worlds with this new system. They could still treat their workers like slaves, but now they didn't have to pay for their food, medical care, or accommodation. But there was one thing factory owners overlooked. Since they weren't slaves or serfs anymore, workers now had the power to quit. They could leave whenever they wanted and never come back. And do you know what happens when you treat people like slaves, but you actually don't have the power to kill or beat them? They quit. Yup, the early 20th century was the first time ghosting your boss became a thing. If factory workers were treated too poorly, or they weren't paid enough for their work, they would either sabotage the machines, work slowly on purpose, or quit without telling anyone, leaving their position empty for days at a time. And no one knew this better than Henry Ford. By the early 1900s, the Ford factory was a revolving door of factory workers who were hired, fired, or resigned faster than it took to train them to actually do their new jobs. And I'm not exaggerating here. In 1913, the Ford factory employed around 13,000 people at any given time. And yet 50,000 workers were hired and left the factory that same year. That meant that workers were leaving pretty much every 3 months, and a single position could be filled by 4 different people in a single year, which wasn't exactly great for productivity. And we all know what a stickler Ford was for maximum efficiency. People were literally coming to work for a few months, getting all the training to operate Ford's machines, and then disappearing because the conditions were that horrible. In 1916 alone, just one Ford plant recorded 200 severed fingers and 75,000 severe cuts, burns, and puncture wounds. Top that off with the terrible pay and treatment, and you can see why Ford couldn't keep an employee longer than 3 months. Something had to change. Ford realized that since all his workers had free will now and could leave whenever they wanted, if his factories tortured people too much, it would actually be counterproductive. They would leave the company, sabotage his machinery, or just slack off and slow everything down. But if you gave them just enough freedom and money to keep their heads above water, if you made the working conditions just safe enough to where it's more of a slow boil versus, getting amputated on the job, they would want to work. They would want to keep their jobs, and that meant more productivity for you. So in 1914, Henry Ford debuted something revolutionary, the 40-hour workweek. Instead of working up to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, each Ford employee would only have to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. On top of that, Ford doubled the pay for each of his workers. The entire country was shocked. Other factory owners were shocked. Doing this would cost the company $10 million, or 50% of its profit for that year. But Henry Ford knew he was onto something. Within a year of these new work schedules, the number of employees that left Ford dropped from 50,000 to just 2,900 workers. And since now he could have 3 shifts working a total of 24 hours a day, the company ended up building 2,000 more cars than expected and making even more profits. Sure, the working conditions were still just as dangerous, and the jobs were just as mindless and repetitive, but how could anyone say no to double the pay in less hours? For Henry Ford, it was a small price to pay. And now everyone wanted to work at Ford, which meant that Henry Ford had them right where he wanted them. They still kinda hated their jobs, but none of them were willing to leave because the salary was just too good. Where else am I gonna make this much money? Sound familiar? They were just happy that now they were making $5 a day, so they kept obediently chugging along. And here's the thing. Since Ford switched to this 40-hour workweek, if the other factory owners wanted to stay in business, they would have to switch to it too. So one by one, factory owners across the land caved in, and they adopted Ford's new system. And just like that, the 40-hour workweek, eventually known as the 9 to 5, became the status quo. It became the first pillar that they used to keep you trapped. And this status quo has lasted to this day. Think about that for a second. The same system invented for factory workers in the early 1900s industrial age is still the same exact system we're forced to work to this day. And to be fair, it was a massive improvement for the time. It was almost too big of an improvement. Now slaves, workers only had to work 8 hours a day, which meant now they had all this free time after work. They had time to ponder about life, to ponder about their goals, to ponder about maybe one day breaking free and maybe even starting their own thing. In other words, the workers now had time to think, the most dangerous of all acts. See, thinking is the enemy of this cog-like utopia we're building. Think about it, every ounce of wealth, every improvement for the human race, every climb up the social ladder has all come from the simple act of thinking. Literally sitting down with a pen and paper and asking yourself, hey, what's my purpose in life? Is this job gonna get me there? How can I break free? I highly recommend you actually do this, by the way. Thinking is literally the only thing that separates us from the animals. Thinking is what gets you out of bad situations, out of a life you don't like. Thinking is the greatest superpower on this planet that we've all been gifted with. Which is exactly why if you run a country, you need to condition the masses to not think. You need to condition them not to use their brain. Because if they use their brains, the only possible outcome is that they're not gonna want to fall in line. They're gonna want to change the status quo. I'm gonna repeat this one more time because this is the most important thing in this entire video. The only possible outcome of the masses thinking for themselves is change. So needless to say, something needed to be done. But luckily for those in charge, a fellow puppet master was already hard at work, solving that pesky problem of free thoughts. While Henry Ford was perfecting the 9-to-5 trap, John D. Rockefeller wanted to tackle the problem a little higher upstream. By the late 1800s, there were all these factory jobs, but back then, much of America was still rural. Most people lived on farms. They knew how to do farm jobs. They didn't know how to operate machinery or work at an oil refinery. There was a skill gap. So Rockefeller knew that he needed to educate the masses on a grand scale, or else America would have a shortage of factory workers, slowing down that much needed economic growth. But as you can guess by now, we don't want to educate them too much. We're not trying to create free thinkers here. We need factory workers that fall in line. And so he set out to create a never-ending pipeline of obedient factory workers. And the best way to do that is to get them while they're young. Luckily by that time, mandatory public schools were already a thing. And these were not free-thinking schools by any stretch of the imagination. America's early public schools were all based on what's called the Prussian education system. See, Prussia was an empire that existed in now modern-day Germany, and in the 18th century, Prussia conquered Poland, and it needed a way to convince the Polish people to accept their new German rulers. But the problem is, no one likes getting colonized. The Polish people were proud of their heritage, and they viewed the Prussians as the enemy. So the Prussians needed a way to get the Polish people to throw away their Polish identity and accept German imperial nationalism. They needed to Germanize them. And the Prussians weren't stupid. They knew that they could never convince Polish adults to become German. Polish adults had too much pride. They had been patriotic Polish people their entire lives. But the children were a whole nother story. The children didn't know the real history behind Prussia's colonization of Poland. The children didn't understand why their parents hated Prussia. Ah yes, the children were much more moldable. If Prussia could infiltrate the minds of the Polish children and condition them to be German, they could decimate Polish culture in a single generation. And what better way to do that than to hammer Prussian propaganda into the children's heads 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for a nice 8 years straight. And so the Prussian education system was born. For 8 years, children between the ages of 5 to 13 years old would be separated from their parents for 6 hours a day to be educated. And if you didn't give up your kid to the States, your kid would be taken away from you and forced into school anyways. Which is something that we just accept today, but it's pretty weird to think about. And what kind of education were they exposed to, you may ask? Well, children were divided by age, not by what they've already learned or what they want to learn. They were taught that the teacher is the ultimate authority, that the children are just there to provide empty heads that the teacher is paid to fill. In the Prussian education system, teaching certificates became a thing, where the one and only qualification you need to teach was this official piece of paper. Whether or not you were actually good at teaching doesn't matter. This is also where the concept of the final exam came about, where if you want to get into certain professions, you needed to pass. This is also where the concept of hour-long classes came about. No depth, no time to develop a passion or hone a skill, definitely no curriculum on how to make money or move up in the world, just 1 hour for each subject and then you're rushed off to the next. And of course, they made sure to instill a strong Prussian national identity in their pupils. Starting to sound familiar, right? And if you think this sounds way too far-fetched, this is exactly what China is doing right now to the Muslim Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region of China. They probably took notes from the Prussians. And here's the thing, this new Prussian education system worked shockingly well. One Prussian philosopher brilliantly described their education model by writing, "Education should be aimed at destroying free will so that after pupils are thus schooled, they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished." When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. It was as poetic as it was true. If you want a submissive population that you can rule over, like a dog that gets shocked when he barks, you have to condition them not to think. And as this quote-unquote education system spread all over Germany, it became clear to other nations that this system was the perfect nation-building tool that they didn't even know they needed. One British observer said the Prussian system is actually producing a spirit of acquiescence to arbitrary power, that it was designed to quote enslave the human mind. So naturally, it started spreading all over Europe, and it also caught the eye of a few educators over in America. One of these education advocates was a man named Horace Mann, and in 1843 he was so intrigued that he traveled all the way to Germany to see the Prussian system with his own 2 eyes. And by the end of his trip, he was so fascinated, so impressed, that he hurried back to import the system into America. And soon enough, mandatory state-funded public schools started popping up all over America, and they were all based on this exact same Prussian system. By the early 1900s, most kids in America were attending mandatory Prussian-inspired elementary schools. Which brings us back to John D. Rockefeller and his desire to create an endless stream of obedient factory workers. All the pieces were there for him already. The only problem was there wasn't a standard curriculum for American public schools to follow, so most kids ended up learning nothing that would make them useful in an oil refinery, mine, or factory. That was until Rockefeller brought in a man named Frederick T. Gates. Frederick Gates was a trusted advisor to Rockefeller, and what Rockefeller told him to do was simple: take over the American education system. And what he did was diabolical. Frederick Gates started by creating the General Education Board. To the outside world, the General Education Board sounded like this very official governing body that oversaw the education system of America, and that's exactly what Gates and Rockefeller wanted. But in reality, the General Education Board was just some random organization that they created out of thin air. It wasn't created by the government, there was nothing general about it. But since it had Rockefeller money and connections to back it up, within less than a year, the General Education Board went official. It was incorporated by an act of Congress with the official purpose of promoting education within the United States of America, without distinction of race, sex, or creed. And so this made-up organization by Rockefeller was given full reign by the US government to bend the American education system to Rockefeller's will. And bend he did. Rockefeller used the General Education Board to inject billions of dollars into the education system to mold it into his liking, and it worked perfectly. Before, schools had been free to decide on their own curriculum, on their own exams, on how they graded their students. But if you ran a school and you wanted a taste of some of those billions of dollars, well then you had to adopt Rockefeller's curriculum. And on top of that, under the General Education Board, more than 900 high schools were opened in the southern states alone by 1914, all following the exact same conditioning, curriculum and schedule decided by Rockefeller. Rockefeller and other tycoons like Andrew Carnegie were so effective at shaping the education system that the National Education Association said,
"We view with alarm the activity of the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations, agencies not in any way responsible to the people, in their efforts to control the policies of our state educational institutions, to fashion after their conception and to standardize our courses of study, and to surround the institutions with conditions which menace true academic freedom and defeat the primary purpose of democracy."
But by then, it was far too late. By 1918, you could face fines, your kid could be taken away from you by force. You could even face jail time if you didn't ship off your kid to get their public conditioning. Then came the standardized test, the high school credit hour system, and even labeling and medicating kids who didn't do well in this Rockefeller education model, using Rockefeller petrochemical drugs, of course. And it just got worse and worse and worse. In Frederick Gates' own words, quote,
"In our dream we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians. Nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply." End quote.
This is the education system Rockefeller wanted. One that doesn't search for the intrinsic gifts endowed in each of us. One that doesn't create philosophers, authors, artists, or musicians. No, the modern-day education system was designed for one thing and one thing only: to pump out mindless, thoughtless, standardized cogs. Cogs that are perfectly conditioned for 9-to-5 jobs. Rockefeller put it even more succinctly. He said, "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." And that's exactly what he got. Rockefeller cemented the modern-day education system as a second pillar that they use to keep you trapped in the middle class. The average American starts preschool at 3 years old. They then spend the next at least 15 years of their life being taught that if they follow a specific set of instructions and do exactly as they're told, they'll get this guaranteed outcome, a good grade. And that's exactly what you get at a 9 to 5. You go to work, you wait for your boss to give you instructions, you follow them to the T, and you get a guaranteed paycheck. No thinking necessary. The average school day is 6 to 7 hours long, but if you include extracurriculars and homework, it brings it up to around 8 to 9 hours, so even the hours condition you for a job. Schools have strict rules on the clothes you can wear, acceptable behavior, when you need to arrive and leave, when you get to do things like use the bathroom or eat your lunch, just like in the factories. Schools reinforce the belief that there is only one right answer and only one right way to do something, and that any creative thought or customized path is strictly outlawed, just like in the factories. And none of this is accidental. From the moment a child starts to form their beliefs of reality, of life, of what they're capable of, they're placed in a school where the only measure of success is not how creative you are, is not how unique you are, but how well you follow instructions. So are we surprised that most people don't think for themselves? Are we surprised that it feels so hard and so uncomfortable to actually go after our dreams? Are we really surprised that the moment you step out of line, the moment you try to be anything more than average, the moment you try to be an individual, everyone around you tries to tear you down, that everyone around you laughs and ridicules you? But if we just kept these two pillars alone, the education system and rat race jobs, some ambitious peasants still might be able to save enough money together to eventually be free. So obviously these two pillars are not enough. We need one more thing, one more pillar to keep them on the hamster wheel forever. And that third pillar came during the Great Depression. By 1933, America was neck deep in the Great Depression. The economy was stagnating, so people were hoarding their money, as they should. But if you remember, hoarding money is the last thing you as the government want the masses to do. Because hoarding money means no spending means no economic growth, and no economic growth means you're getting voted out of office. So the government needed a way to get the masses to squander away all those hard-earned dollars. Because if the people don't start spending, the economy is going to take lower and lower. Enter President Roosevelt's New Deal. And the most important part of this New Deal? The creation of the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA. See, at the time, only the 1% could own homes. Mortgages were too expensive for the average American to afford. But thanks to the New Deal and the FHA, all of that was about to change. They were going to make mortgages more affordable so that the middle class could also quote-unquote own homes. Of course, they didn't actually own the home. They're in debt to the bank to own their home, but that was neither here nor there. Because when you feel like you quote-unquote own a home, you feel secure, you feel stable, you feel successful, which makes you spend more money. On top of that, when a citizen owns a home on a mortgage, that citizen is guaranteed to never stop working. After all, they wouldn't want their beautiful home to get repoed now, would they? And so the FHA created America's very first affordable home loans. Meaning that if someone couldn't afford to continue paying their mortgage, the government would pay for it. And to the banks, this was a dream come true, because now it meant that they could sell as many loans as they wanted with zero risk to a brand new customer base that couldn't afford it before. And so 7, 10, and 15-year mortgages were born. Now instead of huge down payments of up to 50%, banks would accept as little as 20% as the down payments. And since people had up to 15 years to pay off their house, their monthly payments would be a lot smaller too. It was genius. Suddenly, it wasn't just the rich upper class that could afford to take out a mortgage and buy a house. Now the upper middle class could also own a home. And the key word here is the upper middle class. Because although 15-year mortgages were an improvement, the middle class and lower class still couldn't afford it. So they took it one step further and created the 30-year mortgage. Now, instead of paying $67 a month for a $10,000 house, people could just pay $47 instead. Imagine that, just $47 a month, and you could be a successful homeowner. Pretty irresistible, right? And so the middle class flooded in to buy homes, not realizing that by signing on the dotted line, they basically guaranteed that they would have to work for the next 30 years of their life while being stuck in the exact same place. You would have no room for that passion project, you wouldn't be able to take some time off to find yourself, you would have no possible chance of retiring early. In the government's eyes, every middle class person that bought a home at 30 years old, well, that's just another person that's guaranteed to work for another 30 years until they're 60. But wait, it gets better. See, what the middle class doesn't realize is that people move every 5 to 7 years, and every time they move, they have to get a new mortgage. So the 30-year clock resets all over again. Banks know this, so they set up mortgages in a way where the first few years you own your home, you're mostly paying interest to the bank. You're barely even building any equity. Take a look at this graph. The orange parts of the bars is all the interest you pay each year for your mortgage. And as you can see at the start of your mortgage, almost all of your money is going straight into the banker's pockets. So by the time you move at years 5 to 7, you've mostly paid interest. Now you have to restart the clock, pay mostly interest again, until you move again in another 5 to 7 years and the cycle repeats. Until what you know, you started at 30 years old, 30 years passes by, you're 60 now, you've mostly paid just a bunch of interest to banks your entire working life, you're still working now, and when you die, you get to pass on your mortgage to your kids. And once again, the cycle repeats. So as you can see, the government and the banks have set it up in a way where when most people sign a 30-year mortgage, it isn't just for 30 years, it usually means they're locked in for life.
In which economists and other social commentators say the family that has both mom and dad in the workforce is economically diversified. If he loses his job, she still has her job. If she loses her job, he still has his job. And to me, that is the heart of the two-income trap. When the budget shifted to take account of both of those incomes, so that going from needing 52 paychecks a year in order to make the mortgage payment and the health insurance payment, to needing 104 paychecks a year, his and her paychecks, in order to make the mortgage payment and the health insurance payment. The family didn't get financially safer, the family got riskier. So as prices are shooting up, prices for homes in suburbs, for example, what's happening is women, mothers, were increasingly going back to work to try to hit the target, to try to find a way to pay that mortgage. And what happened? The prices shot up, more of them went to work, the prices shot up again, more of them went to work, and they got caught in a trap that no one foresaw, least of all the families themselves.
But if you thought mortgages were bad, that was just the beginning. Fast forward to the 1960s, and America desperately needed a whole lot more college graduates to build the weapons and technology that would win the Cold War. The problem was most people couldn't afford college.
Once upon a time, nobody borrowed money to go to college. You worked your way through school.
And so the government started giving out loans to a select number of students. And this small, innocent program was working. Kids who couldn't afford university before were now able to attend and help the American war machine. But this also got the higher-ups at these universities excited. We're getting more customers than we ever have before. How much money could we make if we got the US government to make these loans available to everyone? And so they pushed for the program to expand, and it did. By the mid-1960s, the government was paying out so much money to fund student loans that the federal spending topped $100 billion for the first time ever. And this made Congress nervous. All of this money was flowing out, but it took at least 4 years to see any sort of repayments. And when those repayments started, it came in small increments spread out over many years. This was back when Congress was at least a little concerned about not burying us in debt. But the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, was a true believer in higher education. And so if Congress wasn't gonna budge, he would turn elsewhere for help. The banks. And by doing that, he created a debt trap even worse than mortgages, the modern student loan system. By the 1960s, just like with mortgages, the government started guaranteeing student loans. And although that may sound good in theory and it sure does get you votes, this meant that now the more student loans the banks dished out, the more free money they were gonna make, while at the same time, colleges started jacking up their prices. After all, if you were in charge of a college, why wouldn't you? Kids had more money to spend than ever before, and they were spending money that wasn't theirs, so they're not gonna penny pinch as much. You also have zero risk. If a kid drops out, the government is still gonna pay the bill, so it would be foolish not to raise tuition and let everyone in. If you own a restaurant and the government promised to pay all the customers' bills, why wouldn't you charge $1,000 for every dish? And so tuition skyrocketed. And to justify the skyrocketing tuition, universities started looking more and more like vacation resorts instead of centers for learning.
But what you may not know is what many colleges are actually doing with all that money. Pouring it into perks. From upscale eateries to top-of-the-line movie theaters and even water parks. Students living it up in luxury dorms like never before.
And the masses had no choice but to fork it up and take the loan. And because everyone was drinking the Kool-Aid that higher education is important, gradually more and more employers started requiring college degrees for nearly all the 9-to-5 jobs out there. And so poor old Timmy over here has to take on a loan at 18 years old so that he starts in the negative financially before he even graduates. Today, tuition has risen by 1,200%, while inflation has only been 236%. Universities have become extremely powerful. Harvard has over $50 billion, which makes Harvard bigger than many nation-states like Latvia, Bolivia, Jordan, and more. And just like mortgages, these student loans that kids signed onto when they were 18, well, now it forces them to work for the rest of their lives. So the colleges are happy, the banks are happy, the politicians are also very happy, but up until 2005, if you were really down bad, you could at least file for bankruptcy and get your student loans canceled. We can't have that now, can we? We gotta keep them working forever. So that's why in 2005, the politicians passed the Bankruptcy, Abuse Prevention, and Consumer Protection Act of 2005, which made it next to impossible for you to default on your student loan. Today, people owe $1.74 trillion in student loans. That is bigger than the economies of Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and Australia. That's over 43.2 million Americans, many of which will be paying off this debt and much more in interest until the day they die. So much like mortgages, although student loans started off with somewhat decent intentions, the effects are as clear as the chains the middle class are bound by. Which concludes the third and final pillar they use to keep you in the middle class: bad debts. And when you combine all these three pillars together, 9-to-5 jobs, the education system, and bad debts, it's clear why for most people it feels like no matter how hard they work, no matter how hard they hustle, they can never seem to move up in life. The good news is that we are witnessing the end of the first pillar, 9-to-5 jobs. The bad news is that what's replacing it is even worse. Over the last 80 years, we've gotten a lot of new incredible technology: computers, automation, the internet, and more. This means that the average worker today can get a lot more work done compared to a worker in 1947. In fact, take a look at this graph. The same worker today can get nearly 5 times more work done compared to a worker from 1947. So obviously, if a worker is 5 times more productive today, they should be getting paid 5 times more money, right? Or at least we should be able to work 5 times less and still get paid the same amount, right? Wrong. As you can see here, something strange happened right here in the 1970s where it all splits. Even though workers are being way more productive, as you can see with the productivity line, they're getting more work done, they're producing more stuff in the same amount of time, your wages, your salary have stagnated all the way until today. And of course, most people are still working 40 hours a week or more, even though they're making their employers way more money than ever. While the 1% has had it great. See, while the bottom 90% of wages have stagnated since the 1970s, the 1%'s wages have skyrocketed by 138%. And CEOs, they now get paid 296 times more than the average worker. See, the promise of technology has always been that we would be in this utopia where we will work less while getting more. And that has been the case. Just for the 1% though. The rest of the populace has stayed right where they need to be.
There isn't, as much progress happening as advertised, and that rather than racing towards utopia or dystopia, the much bigger problem is one of, relative stagnation. It is, and it sort of manifests economically in that, for the first time we have a younger generation that's, not clearly doing better than their parents.
But why? What happened in the 1970s that triggered this divide? Well, there are many reasons. The 1962 investment tax credit gave businesses tax breaks for investing in machinery and automation. Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, which meant that the money printer was let loose. Immediately, the dollar's value dropped by at least 50%, while assets like stocks shot up. But since only the rich own that stuff, the gap with the middle and lower class just widened. Then came the Trade Act of 1974, which incentivized businesses to relocate manufacturing overseas, which meant that those same factory owners could now use even cheaper workers overseas. While at the same time, there was the oil shock of the 1970s, which caused a recession and even more inflation, hammering the middle class even more. Then came the 1980s Wall Street culture of maximizing profit while screwing over workers. The 1990s saw the rise of globalization, where we started importing cheap goods from Canada and Mexico, screwing over American manufacturing workers. Then China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, which is when we started buying everything from China, the final nail in the coffin for US manufacturing workers. And finally, we saw the rise of the gig economy, with gig jobs like Uber and DoorDash, where employers have found that not only is it cheaper to use overseas workers for manual labor jobs, it's also cheaper to use gig workers for service-based jobs here in the States. So as you can imagine, this trend of gig jobs is only going to continue, while 9-to-5 jobs are only going to decline. Which brings us to today, where on the bright side with gig jobs, you do get to work your own hours and have more freedom. But you get paid less, you work as a contractor, you have zero benefits, zero retirement, and zero safety nets. Basically, the gig economy is the inevitable final form of everything we've been talking about. What do you do when you can replace a first world employee that's getting paid $40,000 a year with an overseas employee that is just as good for $3 an hour, or a $100,000 per year employee for one that is only $10 an hour? What do you do when those overseas employees are more motivated, more hardworking, and are just as good with English because these countries are teaching their kids English from a young age to compete? What do you do when you have technology that makes the majority of the remaining jobs in America useless? Well, it's simple. You fire all the expensive 9-to-5 workers that want all these annoying things like benefits, retirement, sick days, paid time off, and you replace them with workers from affordable countries for the jobs that can be done remotely, and for the few jobs that have to be done in person, you replace them with gig workers. Where as a gig worker, you get to have all the downsides of being both a contractor and a 9-to-5 worker with none of the upside. So as you can imagine, in the near future, first world countries are going to keep losing more and more jobs, and it's only a matter of time until your 9-to-5 job could be next. And after all, can you really blame the business owners for doing this? If you were in their shoes and you had the opportunity for less employees, less overhead, and less headaches that come with having full-time employees, from payroll taxes to retirement plans to insurance, so you can have more money for yourself and your family, would you not do it? It's just a smart thing to do. As Charlie Munger says, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And the incentive right now is to let go of full-time employees in favor of much more affordable gig workers and overseas workers. Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, takes it one step further. He predicts that 9-to-5 jobs will be completely extinct by 2034.
You may actually be working in the gig economy, or you may have 2 or 3 gigs. All of these things are the directional changes from what we've seen in the workforce for the last few decades.
So as you can see, we've kind of come full circle. We went from a world that heavily favored business owners, where factory workers had to line up at the crack of dawn to hopefully get paid for the day, to then transitioning to 9-to-5 jobs, which at least favored employees a lot more. And now we're right back to where we started. A world that almost completely favors business owners, where gig workers get paid the least amount of money possible with zero job security and zero benefits. But somehow, it gets worse. Because in September 2024, the Federal Reserve did something that will accelerate this collapse even faster. September 18, 2024, the Federal Reserve, America's money printer, announces that for the first time in 4 years, they will be cutting rates and going back to an easy monetary policy. And this is going to cause exponentially worse inflation. And it really will be exponentially worse. Take a look at the government's debt. As you can see, it's growing at an exponential rate. It keeps on hockey sticking. And as the government's debt gets exponentially higher, the interest payments on that debt will also get exponentially higher, as you can see with this graph. The problem is we're already at $1.1 trillion in interest payments a year. We're already spending more on interest than we spend on the military, on education, on health, and every other category. This means that out of the $5 trillion the government brings in taxes, our interest payments already make up 20% of all the money the government brings in. And just like how your wealth can compound, if you have $1.1 trillion in interest payments, that's also going to start compounding really fast. So over the next few years, interest payments will only take up more and more of the spending. And what's going to happen when interest payments take up 30%, 40%, 50%? What happens if it gets up to 60%? What about 70%? Well then, this is when the whole house of cards is gonna collapse. This is when the dollar is gonna collapse. And if the dollar collapses, you can say goodbye to American supremacy. So as you can see, this is why the Fed had to lower interest rates. They can't lower spending. We can't spend less on the military. We can't cut grandma's medical bills or poor people's food stamps. They're gonna vote us out of office, remember? And on top of that, even if the government did lower spending, the US government is the country's biggest employer. The US government is the country's biggest buyer of goods and services. It's the world's biggest buyer of goods and services. If the US government just fired a bunch of people and stopped buying stuff, well, guess what? Consumption goes down, economic growth goes down, and boom, economic collapse. Ah yes, as you can see, we're right back to square one where we started this video. That's why although I love that Elon Musk is trying to reduce government spending, it's probably not going to be as big as we need it to be. And again, this is why they had to lower interest rates. By lowering interest rates, it means that the interest rate on their debt is also lower, so their interest payments are not going to go up as fast. This is not going to solve the problem, it only delays it a little bit more. It will kick the can down the road one more time, while also making the inflation we've seen feel like a walk in the park. And because there's a lag from when the Fed lowers rates and when you actually feel the inflation, we will probably start to feel the inflation a year from now in 2026. This means that not only are your living expenses going to skyrocket even more, but also real estate, stocks, gold, crypto. Every asset class is going to shoot up in value. And who owns most of these assets? The rich. So the rich will be just fine during this inflation. But the middle and lower class who don't own any assets, they will get decimated. This is the Great Melt-Up. And just like in 2020, just like in 2008, and just like in the Great Depression, whatever happens in America during the Great Melt-Up will be felt around the world. That's why this is your last chance to make money and pour that money into assets that rise in value before inflation picks up again. And bear in mind, this is not to get rich. This is to simply keep up with inflation, to stay neutral and not get inflated into poverty. Because during this great melt-up, those who are left holding the bag that is the US dollar will be the losers. Because the sad truth is there is no way out. The government dug us this grave, and now the only decision they can make is, do we bury ourselves alive now, or do we keep digging this grave deeper and deeper to hell? Right now, the Federal Reserve's plan is to lower interest rates by 3% by 2026, but we're talking about $33 trillion in debt and growing, so 3% is still way too high. They need to lower rates back down to 0%. But since dropping interest rates down to 0% randomly will lead to more inflation on top of the inflation we already have, that would be political suicide. So the government needs an emergency. They need some kind of excuse, some kind of war, some kind of banking emergency. Just something that they can use as a legitimate excuse to go, well, we gotta lower rates to 0% now. And knowing that this is the government, rest assured that that emergency will come. Whether real or manufactured, we will be back down to 0% interest rates in no time. And when that happens, living expenses will soar like never before. Asset prices like stocks, gold, crypto will soar like never before. Which means the rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer, and the middle class will start drifting into the lower class. Unless they own assets. And as inflation soars, as the dollar becomes a joke, eventually other countries will start losing faith in the dollar. Once that happens, the US government will have no choice but to cut spending. They have to cut food stamps, cut medical bills. But as we talked about earlier, the US government is the country's biggest employer. The US government is the country's biggest buyer of goods and services. The world's biggest buyer of goods and services. So if and when they have to fire a bunch of people and stop buying stuff, well, guess what? It will be a full-blown economic collapse. And in this economic collapse, the US government will have no choice but to turn on the money printer, which will bring in the final phase of the charade, hyperinflation and the collapse of the dollar. And the rich, they will feel some pain from this for sure. But the middle class? Those who don't own any assets will get wiped out. And we will be left with only the rich and the poor. And even if it doesn't get this bad where the dollar collapses under hyperinflation, it's definitely going to make the inflation we've seen look like a walk in the park. If you remember the crisis that we talked about last year that was estimated to be around 2025 to 2028, this is it. This will be the climax of it. But luckily, we do have one saving grace. With Trump in office, whether you like him or not, the market is going to go crazy like it did in his first term. Taxes are going to go down just like Trump did in 2017. There will be less regulation. Elon Musk is going to try to reduce at least some of the government spending. So we could very well be witnessing another American golden age, but only for some. And sure, the lives of the lower and middle class will probably get a little better. Maybe people will finally not get taxed on their tips, which is definitely a much needed improvement. Maybe 9-to-5 jobs will get a little better. But just like during Trump's first term, just like during COVID, the ones that will really benefit, the ones that will really multiply their wealth faster than everyone else, will be those that own assets that rise in value. And what is the fastest way to make a bunch of money so you can actually start buying assets that rise in value while Trump is still in office? By finding some sort of vehicle that makes you money while not being tied to how many hours you work. You have to find some sort of vehicle like this. But as we saw with COVID, not all money-making vehicles are treated equal. Running a small business or a physical business might not benefit you at all. That means these next 10 to 12 months are going to be your one shot to pick the right vehicle for you to make more money so that you too can jump on this golden age to escape the middle class. But the problem is this golden age is going to go by in the blink of an eye. Just think about how fast the last 4 years have gone by since 2020. This is a very short period of time. If you fail to set something up in the next 10 to 12 months, not only will you miss out on all the assets rising in value, but your savings will continue to be wiped out from more inflation, which will make it even harder to escape the middle class. Because once Trump's presidency is over, 10% of the population is going to get to look back and celebrate how they just had their biggest period of growth ever, while the bottom 90% will wake up and realize that they're still in the exact same spot they are right now. The question is, will you be part of that 10%? Will you lock in for the next 12 months so that you too can squeeze this golden age for everything it's got? Or will you watch from the sidelines while the 10% takes it all? Because the important thing to keep in mind is that anyone can be part of this 10%, as long as they reject these pillars that have been designed to keep you down, and instead model the pillars that the top 10% use. Because once Trump is out of office, who knows what's going to happen next? One thing that will happen is the Great Melt-Up. Think about it, the Great Melt-Up has to eventually happen. Government debt is going to keep hockey sticking, and since the government can't afford to go into a recession, they will have to keep lowering rates and printing money. Which means that today, the middle class and the lower class is at a crossroads. On one path, you can lie on your back and accept your fates. You can sit back while Trump makes the market explode. You can wait until the 9-to-5 job eventually gets phased out in 10 years or so. You can wait until Social Security implodes around the same time in 2035, because it's a literal Ponzi scheme. You can hustle and take on multiple gigs, working more than the 40 hours you would be working right now at a 9-to-5, with a very slim chance of ever saving enough to even retire, all the while the Great Melt-Up happens and inflation erases what's left of whatever money you have. Or you can use these next 12 months as your escape. To make the most out of this one final easy money period that we're heading into with the lower rates and Trump before inflation starts kicking in. And so there is a lot of hope during this calm before the storm. But how are you going to take advantage of these next 10 to 12 months when your 9-to-5 job is already not cutting it? When you're already living paycheck to paycheck or maybe only saving a few $100s a month? How are you going to take advantage of these next 10 to 12 months if investing also isn't cutting it? Even if you dropped $100,000 into the market right now, and it somehow goes up by 100% instead of the average 10% over the next 12 months, that's still only going to be $200,000. That's definitely not enough to be free. And if you gamble that into shitcoins, most people end up losing all of it.
By the way, 95% of people do not make money here. You have better odds in Vegas.
So clearly something here has to change. Clearly, if you think like a worker like they condition you in school, then you will get the same outcome as a worker. Getting left behind, staying exactly where you're at while the 10% take it all. That's why in part 2 of this docuseries, we're going to give you all the principles you need to escape this trap. Where they condition you not to think and wait for instructions, we're going to show you how to actually take initiative in this world as a free sovereign individual. Where they condition you to trade your soul for a tiny guaranteed paycheck, we're going to show you an entirely different world where it's impossible not to hit it big, to not hit it out of the park. Where they entrap you in bad debt and terrible deals, we're going to show you how the rich use debt the right way to actually grow their wealth. Peter Thiel once said that the most contrarian thing of all is not to oppose the crowd, but to think for yourself. And we're gonna get you on that path in part 2. It's dropping this Tuesday, so right now click the card on the screen, put in your name and email, it takes like 11 seconds, and be the first to access part 2 when it drops. So click the card on the screen to watch part 2 now. Stay dangerous and I'll see you in part 2.